There is a certain British ingenuity in building systems, so elaborate that misery becomes bureaucratic. Nowhere is this more evident than in the Victorian Workhouse, a 19th century institution devised to solve the problem of poverty by making the experience of being poor considerably more unpleasant than the alternative. Before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you are listening from and what time it is. It is always interesting to see who is joining us from around the world. Now then, let us ease into tonight's journey together. The Victorian Workhouse belongs firmly to the reign of Queen Victoria, which spanned from 1837 to 1901. Though the system's roots reach back earlier, these institutions, spread across England, Wales, and parts of Scotland, run by officials with titles nearly as stiff as their collars. Workhouses were meant to provide shelter, food, and employment for those in desperate need, which in practice meant shelter that discouraged lingering, food that challenged optimism, and employment that often felt designed to remind the inmate of every possible alternative. This was poverty in the age of industrial progress, measured out in ounces of gruel and hours of stone breaking. It is tempting to see the workhouse as all bleakness, but within its walls lay small absurdities. For instance, the uniform ration of bread doled out to men, women, and children alike never varied with age or circumstance. A 5-year-old and a 50-year-old would each receive the same slice, as if hunger itself were a democratic principle. Another example, rules forbade inmates to speak at meals, lest conversation provide some illicit comfort along with the boiled potatoes. The theory was simple. Idleness bred vice, and a silent mouth produced neither. Picture, if you will, the daily breakfast parade. A long, narrow hall, lined with benches, the inmates sitting in identical smocks, clutching tin bowls. The food is a pale, lumpy gruel, served with exactly one portion of stale bread. No talking, the only sound is the scrape of spoons and the occasional cough. The staff, dressed in slightly better cloth, if not noticeably better spirits, watch from the far end, ensuring that no one is tempted to pocket an extra crust. Even the weather seems to cooperate. With fog pressing against the high windows and the faint smell of damp stone reminding everyone that comfort happens elsewhere, some found the workhouse punishing not for its physical demands, but its relentless efficiency. Upon entry, families were separated without ceremony. Husbands, wives, and children were sent to different wings, their only hope of communication a chance glimpse during chapel. The very architecture encouraged isolation, with wards arranged to keep the unfortunate from forming any sense of community. If solidarity is the poor man's friend, the workhouse was designed to keep friendships at arm's length, if not entirely out of reach. In the chapters ahead, the daily rituals and small humiliations of the Victorian workhouse will unfold in all their regulated monotony. There will be gruel, certainly, and plenty of it, but there will also be the quiet resilience of those who endured, and the odd, faintly comic missteps of those who ran the system. Settle in, if comfort allows, for a glimpse into an institution where purpose and punishment arrive together. Wrapped, as ever, in red tape, the Victorian workhouse emerged in the early decades of Queen Victoria's reign, growing from the anxieties of a society that had convinced itself poverty could be organized into submission. The time is England in the middle decades of the 19th century, a country that had seen factories spring up like stubborn weeds across its landscape. The population swelled as rural people drifted into towns, lured by the promise of steady work and dissuaded by the reality of unpredictable wages, industrial accidents, and the occasional surprise outbreak of typhus. For those unfortunate enough to fall behind through illness, failed harvest, or the simple arithmetic of too many mouths and too little income, the workhouse beckoned as a last resort. The system did not owe its soul to kindness. It owed rather more to the Poor Law Amendment Act of 1834, a piece of legislation crafted by men who found virtue in discomfort. The workhouse was not designed for comfort, and certainly not for pride. Its buildings were solid and unadorned, mostly constructed of brick or stone, with high iron-fenced walls and gates that did little to encourage casual visits. Windows were set high in the walls, both to prevent distraction and to offer the minimum view of the world outside. From the roadway, one might see only the looming outline of a main block, flanked by a laundry on one side and a fever ward on the other. The architecture did not invite optimism. It encouraged efficiency and, perhaps unintentionally, a certain stoic resignation. Inside, spaces were arranged with the precision of a factory floor. Male and female wards occupied opposite ends of the complex. Children, once separated from their parents, were funneled into their own dormitories. There were workrooms, kitchens, schoolrooms, and a chapel, each defined by its singular purpose. Furniture was heavy and plain, built to last through years of use, and ideally, resist the temptation to comfort. Beds were arranged in rows, mattresses stuffed with straw, and blankets as thin as the arguments for the institution's benevolence. The smell of boiled cabbage clung to the walls, mixing with the sharper scent of industrial soap and the underlying must of damp stone. Daily life in the workhouse was defined by the clock. The bell sounded early, before sunrise in winter, and not much later in summer. Inmates rose and queued for their ration of food, which did little to distract from the chill. Clothing was uniform, supplied by the workhouse itself, and designed for durability rather than style. It was a peculiar triumph to make every person's appearance equally uninspiring. Boots were sturdy and ill-fitting, dresses and trousers faded quickly, the colours soon indistinguishable from the stone around them. It was said, not entirely in jest, that by midsummer, the palette of workhouse fashion resolved into a single shade of greyish-brown. Meals were simple to the point of austerity. Breakfast might bring a bowl of thin gruel and a thick slice of bread. Lunch was often boiled potatoes, or a stew described in official documents as nutritious, though rarely as appetizing. Dinner, for those who remained, was bread and perhaps a hint of cheese. The absence of seasoning was not accidental. Luxury, after all, had no place in an institution built on deterrence. The dining halls echoed with the scrape of spoons and the occasional cough. Conversation was discouraged, and in some places, expressly forbidden. The logic held that silence maintained order, though it did little to encourage digestion. Religion held a required but rather joyless role in the workhouse. Chapel attendance was compulsory, even for those whose faith had lapsed under the combined pressure of hardship and bland rations. Hymns were sung with more discipline than enthusiasm. The chaplain, if present, delivered sermons that stressed the virtues of patience and humility. The message was clear: suffering carried its own reward, particularly when supervised by local parish officials. For many, faith became less a source of hope and more an extension of routine. Trade and economy, as far as the inmates were concerned, revolved around labor within the walls. The most common tasks included breaking stones, picking oakum, and, if fortunate, helping in the laundry or kitchen. These jobs were not selected for their utility to the wider world, but rather for their ability to occupy hands and minds without offering much in the way of satisfaction. Tools were basic, stones were broken with hammers, oakum teased apart with bare fingers until they ached. The noise of work carried through the halls, punctuated by instructions barked by overseers whose own uniforms were only marginally less dreary. The wider world passed by with little notice. News arrived slowly, usually in the form of rumor, or the occasional charity visitor. Days bled into one another, marked by the same routines, the same heavy steps in the corridors, the same faint hope that conditions might improve, or, failing that, at least not worsen. In the end, the workhouse did not so much solve poverty as rearrange it. Its legacy can be counted not only in bricks and ledgers, but in the memory of those who found themselves behind its high stone walls. The story of the workhouse is, above all, a study in how a society imagined it might tidy away its poor, and how the poor, with little choice, endured the tidying. Inside the workhouse, order was maintained, less by force than by an elaborate system of rules and routines. The Victorian authorities were convinced that not only poverty, but human behavior itself, could be shaped by sufficiently detailed regulation. From the moment of arrival, the new inmate encountered a barrage of instructions, each rule accompanied by the threat of discipline for infractions, real or imagined. The daily schedule unfolded with a precision that would have made any railway timetable blush. There was a specific time for waking, for lining up, for eating, for labor, for instruction, for religious observance, and finally for sleep. To deviate from this pattern was to invite the attention of the master or the matron, whose powers were as extensive as their patience was limited. Social life within these walls was, if anything, even more closely regulated than the timetable itself. Family bonds, which might have offered some small comfort, were systematically severed. Men, women, and children were separated not only into different wards, but into entirely different parts of the building. This was not a temporary arrangement. Letters and visits were discouraged. If not forbidden entirely, even siblings might pass years in the same workhouse without more than an occasional glimpse across a courtyard or in the echoing Sunday service. This policy was justified by the authorities in the language of moral improvement. Family ties, they reasoned, might distract from the lessons of discipline and industry. In practice, it produced something closer to quiet despair, a loneliness that settled in long before the chill from the flagstone floors. The staff of the workhouse performed their duties with an air of weary efficiency. The master oversaw the entire operation with the help of clerks, nurses, cooks, and a chaplain, each with their own precise role. Inspectors from the poor law guardians appeared on occasion, touring the wards with expressions that suggested they would rather be anywhere else. There were accounts of charitable matrons who attempted small kindness, an extra blanket in winter, a second ladle of broth for the sick. But these efforts were often constrained by budget and policy. The economic realities of the workhouse were inescapable. The system was funded by local taxes, and there was always pressure to reduce costs. Frugality was considered a virtue, and the thinness of the soup reflected the thickness of official resolve. Religious instruction held a central, if uninspiring, position in the workhouse routine. Daily prayers and weekly sermons filled the chapel with pious words and the sound of shoes scraping against cold stone. The chaplain's voice echoed through the nave as he reminded the assembled of the redemptive qualities of suffering. The congregation responded with the dutiful murmurs of those who had heard the same sermon many times before. Religion provided a structure, but rarely solace. It was an obligation, no different in essence from scrubbing a floor or breaking a stone. Even the hymns were chosen for their moral content, rather than their ability to lift the spirits. Trade and economic activity within the workhouse rarely extended beyond its gates. Inmates labored to produce goods, teased oakum, laundered linen, broken stone, that sometimes found their way into local markets, though the financial benefit was mostly retained by the institution. Some workhouses kept small kitchen gardens, tended by the elderly or infirm. These plots yielded potatoes, cabbages, and onions, which supplemented the unvarying diet. The gardens rarely thrived, beset by poor soil and the half-hearted attention of those conscripted to their care. Still, the sight of green amidst the stone offered a faint contrast. Even if hope remained in short supply, architecturally, the workhouse was a triumph of uniformity. Long corridors stretched between identical wards, punctuated by locked doors and the occasional notice board listing regulations. Windows were set high, more to admit light than to invite distraction. The sound within was a constant shuffle of feet, punctuated by the clang of buckets and the distant drip of water in stone basins. Cleanliness was enforced with the same rigor as silence. Strong-smelling soap and cold water provided the only luxuries available, and bathing was scheduled with the same regularity as meals. Personal possessions were few. Each inmate was issued a mug, a spoon, a comb, and little else. The broader political context did little to improve matters for those inside. The poor law guardians who managed the system operated under the principle of less eligibility. This meant that conditions in the workhouse must always be less appealing than those of the lowest paid labourer outside, regardless of how miserable that might prove in practice. This approach was intended to deter all but the most desperate from seeking relief. In effect, the workhouse became a byword for hardship, and the threat of its walls hung over the poor like a perennial cloud. As the 19th century progressed, the principle of charity remained carefully hedged by suspicion and economy. Reports of abuses and neglect occasionally reached the public, prompting debate in newspapers and parliament. The voices of reformers and critics were seldom heeded quickly, and change arrived at a pace that could almost be measured in generations rather than years. Within the walls, however, life continued as it always had, marked by the persistent effort to regulate not only poverty, but the experience of being poor. In this, the workhouse stood as a monument not to compassion, but to the uneasy compromise between duty and discomfort that defined Victorian society. Within the workhouse, daily routines were upheld with an almost religious regularity. The morning began before dawn, summoned by the clang of the workhouse bell, an instrument notable for its volume rather than its musicality. Inmates rose from straw mattresses, often chilled by the night air that seeped through the thick stone walls. Each person dressed in the uniform provided by the institution, garments chosen for their robustness and their singular ability to render their wearers entirely indistinct from one another. The communal washrooms were functional, but hardly welcoming. Water in the basins was cold, and soap came in hard, yellowish blocks, with a smell that lingered on the skin far longer than any sense of hygiene. Breakfast was served in silence. Inmates gathered in the dining hall, where benches and long tables provided enough seating for the residents, though comfort was held to be unnecessary. The fare was as consistent as it was uninspiring. Gruel appeared with monotonous frequency, accompanied by coarse bread and occasionally a measure of weak tea. Despite the absence of any seasoning, food was carefully measured, with each portion weighed and recorded by the kitchen staff. Conversation was discouraged, and the only sounds that punctuated the meal were the scrape of tin spoons on bowls and the regular tread of the overseers. Labour began soon after, divided into tasks appropriate, or perhaps more accurately, available for each age and category of inmate. Adult men were most commonly set to breaking stones or picking oakum, an activity that involved unravelling old rope into separate fibres. This laborious task produced aching fingers and little sense of accomplishment, but it was considered suitably humbling. Women were typically directed to the laundry, the kitchens, or to sewing and mending clothing. The laundry room was a place of perpetual steam, with windows fogged by the heat and the smell of lye drifting through the air. Even the youngest children were not exempt from work, though their tasks were lighter and more monotonous, such as carrying messages or sorting rags. The smell of the workhouse changed with the hour. In the morning, boiled linen and wet stone dominated. By midday, the aroma of stewing vegetables took precedence, a blend of cabbage and root vegetables boiling in vast cauldrons. The midday meal offered little relief from monotony, stew and bread again, always measured, always plain. The kitchen itself was a study in Victorian efficiency, with large iron pots, rows of wooden spoons, and shelves stacked with the institutional crockery. Frugality ruled every decision. Any scrap that could be reused, whether a crust of bread or a turnip peel, was saved for another day. Education was provided for the children, though its aim was less enlightenment than preparation for a life of honest labour. Schoolrooms were bare, with rows of desks and slates. Lessons focused on reading, writing, basic arithmetic, and, perhaps most importantly, obedience. Punishments for inattention or error were swift, meted out by teachers who understood that discipline was more highly valued than curiosity. Religious instruction was pervasive, woven through lessons and reinforced by regular chapel attendance. The walls of the schoolroom echoed with recitations of scripture and multiplication tables. Though enthusiasm rarely took root, throughout the day, the workhouse was kept in a state of rigorous cleanliness. Scrubbing floors, polishing door handles, and sweeping the yards occupied any time not devoted to the official tasks. The floors, made of flagstone or worn wood, were never allowed to accumulate much dirt. The occasional inspector, arriving unannounced, would run a gloved finger along a windowsill, or stare meaningfully at a particularly stubborn patch of damp on the wall. Cleanliness, it seemed, was both a virtue and a constant adversary. Outside, the kitchen garden struggled to produce enough to supplement the meager rations. Rows of potatoes, cabbage, and onions were tended with indifferent diligence, the soil uncooperative, and the tools well worn. The produce, when it arrived, was greeted without ceremony before being consigned to the communal stew pot. On Sundays, the routine shifted only slightly. Chapel attendance was extended, with a longer sermon and the briefest opportunity for families, separated by regulation, to glimpse one another from a distance. For some, this was the week's most notable event, a fleeting reminder of connection in an environment built to minimize it. The broader society continued to turn outside the gates. Parliament debated the merits and excesses of the poor law. Newspapers printed stories from time to time of scandal or rare kindness within the workhouse system. Yet, within these walls, daily existence proceeded much as it had the day before, defined by rules, routines, and the persistent effort to keep deprivation just orderly enough to satisfy both the letter and the spirit of Victorian reform. Evenings in the Victorian workhouse brought no marked relaxation of discipline. Once the final tasks of the day were completed, the population retreated to the dormitories, where rest was anticipated, though rarely found in abundance. The dormitories themselves were large and sparsely furnished. Metal bed frames stood in rows, each with a thin straw mattress and a faded blanket that offered about as much warmth as public sympathy. The air was heavy with the smells of worn fabric, damp stone, and the lingering traces of boiled vegetables. Windows, set high in the walls, were rarely opened for fear of drafts, so the scent of humanity often competed only with that of institutional soap. Silence was expected after lights out. Talking, if discovered, could lead to a reprimand or extra chores. Light came from oil lamps fixed to the wall, extinguished at a set hour, regardless of the season. For many, sleep came slowly, interrupted by coughing, the shifting of restless bodies, or the distant clatter of staff completing their final rounds. There was little opportunity for privacy. Possessions were limited to the absolute minimum: a mug, a comb, perhaps a worn book, if the master was particularly lenient. Clothing, including boots, was collected at night to prevent escape attempts, though the prospect of fleeing into the cold with no resources attracted only the most desperate. The next morning arrived quickly, heralded by the same bell and the same unyielding expectations. Routine supplanted hope. The purpose of these strict cycles was not only to maintain order, but to reinforce the core principle of the workhouse system, that relief should be just difficult enough to deter all but the utterly destitute. This philosophy was written into the very rules and echoed by visiting poor law guardians who inspected accounts, reviewed rations, and consistently advocated economies in both comfort and expense. Some guardians were themselves the products of similar institutions, which perhaps explains the enthusiasm with which they upheld the tradition. Children occupied a peculiar position within the workhouse. On paper, the authorities professed a strong commitment to their education and improvement. In practice, instruction was rudimentary and geared towards producing compliant, employable adults. The curriculum consisted mainly of reading, arithmetic, religious instruction, and simple trades, such as sewing or basic carpentry. Any ability to recite scripture was considered especially promising. Play was structured and brief, often a supervised walk in the yard, rather than unstructured recreation. Friendships developed quietly, sustained by brief exchanges and a tacit understanding that connections must be concealed from the watchful eyes of staff. The food, by evening, provided little reason to anticipate mealtimes. Supper usually repeated the day's staples, a coarse bread, sometimes a ladle of thin broth, or weak tea. The meal was consumed in silence, overseen by staff, who ensured that no portion was hoarded for later. Any deviation from the routine was notable. For instance, the rare luxury of a piece of cheese, distributed only on special occasions, and in slices so thin as to be nearly symbolic. The monotony of the diet was not accidental. The architects of the system believed that comfort and variety might undermine the spirit of self-reliance. Though there was little evidence, the policy produced anything but disappointment and indigestion. Architecture within the workhouse complex remained functional, bordering on severe. Corridors and staircases were wide enough to discourage loitering, but narrow enough to make supervision easy. The walls, built of brick or stone, echoed with the footsteps of both inmates and staff. Doors to the outside world were kept locked, and the keys remained strictly under the control of the master and his senior staff. The perimeter walls, topped with iron railings or broken glass, served as reminders that while the workhouse was not technically a prison, it rarely threatened to be mistaken for a place of refuge. Religious observance continued to impose its rhythm. On the week, chapel on Sundays allowed the population a change of scenery, though not necessarily of spirit. Hymns sung with dutiful restraint rose to the rafters, occasionally drowned out by the sounds of coughing or the indigent shuffling of boots. The chaplain's sermons, invariably focused on humility, discipline, and endurance, did not often inspire joy. Still, the regularity of worship did offer a structure that some found faintly reassuring, if only because it marked time's slow passage. By the middle decades of Queen Victoria's reign, the workhouse system had become a fixture of British social policy. Reformers and critics raised their objections in periodicals and in Parliament, highlighting abuses and inefficiencies. In response, the guardians of the system introduced incremental changes, slightly improved rations, better accounting of complaints, occasional leniency during times of epidemic or bad harvests. Such gestures, though genuine, never altered the fundamental character of the institution. Its purpose remained to contain poverty, not to mitigate it, and to remind all who entered that acceptance came with the price of relentless uniformity. As dusk settled over the rooftops and the lamps in the master's office flickered low, the boundaries between one day and the next blurred into persistent sameness. Within those brick walls, the outside world's progress seemed remote, leaving the residents to measure their lives in routines, regulations, and the faint hope that somewhere beyond the gates, the world might one day remember both the causes and the costs of hardship. Outside the workhouse, Victorian society pressed forward with its own particular mix of reform and resistance to change. The period saw the steady growth of industrial wealth, yet also the persistence of deep poverty in both urban and rural communities. Inside the workhouse walls, the impact of these broader shifts was felt only in small practical ways. Wages in nearby factories might rise or fall, the price of bread might fluctuate, and yet the routines of the institution remained almost defiantly static. There were occasional discussions among the poor law guardians about whether to adjust the rations or permit an extra blanket during a harsh winter, but such gestures were always carefully weighed against the core objective of discouraging all but the most desperate from seeking relief. Within the wards, daily life continued in its accustomed grooves. The staff maintained careful records of everything: births, deaths, illnesses, and supplies consumed. Each entry was made in a neat, looping script, in heavy leather-bound volumes. The mere act of maintaining these ledgers seemed as important as the accuracy of their contents. Bureaucracy provided both the scaffolding and the excuse for the system's endurance. Visiting inspectors, when they appeared, took great interest in these books, sometimes more so than in the welfare of the people whose lives they documented. The staff responded to these official visits with hurried tidying, polished boots, and a general air of watchfulness. There was always the possibility that some small slip, an unwashed floor, or a missing ration of soap would be noted and reported. Personal relationships within the workhouse were governed by both necessity and regulation. Friendships were rare and often confined to a knowing look or a whispered word exchanged in moments when staff attention wandered. In a place where trust was discouraged by design, bonds formed quietly, if at all. Alliances tended to be practical rather than sentimental, built on shared chores or even a mutual dislike of a particular supervisor. Family members separated by the regulations found inventive ways to communicate, passing messages in the laundry or exchanging news through sympathetic staff, but risked punishment if discovered. Isolation was perhaps the most profound feature of workhouse life, shaping the inhabitants as surely as any timetable or diet. The influence of contemporary religion remained present, if somewhat faded. While chapel attendance was compulsory, genuine piety was a private affair. Some inmates clung to their beliefs, drawing a measure of comfort from prayer or hymn, while others simply endured the rituals as one more requirement to be met. The chaplain, like the rest of the staff, was bound by the routines of the place. His sermons rarely strayed from familiar themes: charity, humility, perseverance, and his pastoral visits were usually conducted within view of a matron or clerk. Less spiritual solace threatened to become actual comfort. Still, the rhythm of church services at least disrupted the monotony and provided an official opportunity for reflection, if not for genuine hope. Trade between the workhouse and the outside world was limited. On rare occasions, surplus produce from the kitchen garden, bundles of laundered goods, or small handicrafts made by the inmates, were sold locally, with the profits returning to the institution's accounts. The proceeds funded minor improvements, perhaps a new mop, or for the especially fortunate, a fresh paint of lime wash on the walls. Most inmates never saw any direct benefit, though the arrival of a new broom was sometimes greeted with more excitement than the annual sermon on compassion. A few reforms, spurred by public outcry or the investigative journalism of the period, gradually filtered into the system. The most notable of these were the attempts to improve conditions for children. By the 1860s, there were scattered efforts to provide better food, more structured education, and even the possibility of apprenticeship schemes to prepare them for life outside the walls. Newspapers occasionally reported on startling instances of cruelty or neglect. Politicians debated the correct balance between thrift and humanity. Though action often lagged far behind rhetoric, the workhouse, with its inertia and vast paperwork, yielded to change only with great reluctance. Within the building, the material world remained stubbornly unremarkable. Corridors were swept each day. The smell of soap and boiled vegetables lodged permanently in the air. In the laundry, steam rose from great copper vats, coating windows with condensation and filling the air with a tang of lye. The kitchen was a place of heat and noise, with cooks and helpers moving between iron stoves and great cauldrons of stew, their movements directed by the unending requirements of the timetable. The gardens outside the walls were subject to the seasons, their progress marked by the gradual appearance of green, or, more often, by the slow withering of undernourished plants. All the while, the workhouse maintained its peculiar relationship with the surrounding community. For some, It was a necessary institution, a last defense against destitution. For others, it was a warning, a place to be avoided at any cost. Its gates stood as a reminder that poverty was not merely endured, but also catalogued, managed, and at least on paper, contained. The progress of the Victorian era, measured in iron and steam, seemed always to pass just outside the reach of those within these walls. Despite its intended purpose as a deterrent, the Victorian workhouse inevitably became a microcosm of the society outside its walls. By the third quarter of the 19th century, the line between pauper and labourer often blurred so completely that it seemed almost arbitrary. Economic slumps could send entire families from precarious independence to regulated dependency in a matter of weeks. The industrial cities of the north and the rural districts of the south alike sent their poor to the nearest workhouse, where regional differences in cuisine and accent were efficiently flattened by the rules and routines of institutional life. Inmates from London, Liverpool, or a Cotswold village all found themselves governed by the same ledgers, the same ration cards, and the same suspicion that poverty was as much a personal failing as a misfortune. The organisation of labour inside the workhouse reflected the wider Victorian belief in the redemptive value of toil. Official reports spoke approvingly of the discipline instilled by repetitive work. In reality, the tasks assigned were rarely productive in the broader economic sense. Stone breaking, oakum picking, and laundry did little to advance industry. But they succeeded admirably at occupying time and exhausting energy. There was an uneasy sense that if leisure were permitted, idleness, and by extension, moral decline, would soon follow. The authorities did not trust the poor with spare moments. Every hour was to be accounted for, every movement supervised by the attentive, if not always attentive, staff. The rhythm of the day was punctuated by the sounds of labour. In the stone yard, hammers met granite, producing a dull, repetitive clatter that echoed across the walls. In the laundry, water sloshed in great tubs, and the slap of wet linen on scrub boards mixed with the hiss of boiling water. Sharp instructions were delivered in clipped tones by overseers, whose own authority rested as much on their office as on any particular talent for management. Work was occasionally interrupted by visits from local dignitaries, who toured the facilities with stiff greetings and polite observations before retreating to the comfort of their own drawing rooms. Their visits inspired a brief flurry of activity, followed by a return to normal inertia once the last pair of polished shoes had disappeared from view. Meals remained a central feature of workhouse life, not because they promised variety or pleasure, but because they marked the day's progress. The midday meal, grandly referred to as dinner, was distributed from vast vats. The contents were simple, root vegetables, barley, and occasionally the remnants of yesterday's bread. Spices and meat appeared rarely, reserved for the sick ward or for holidays, when a ration of suet pudding or a shred of boiled beef might be issued in a spirit of grudging festivity. The sensation of perpetual hunger never quite left, and in many cases, inmates described the meals as something to be survived rather than enjoyed. The dining hall itself, with its scrubbed tables and bare walls, was kept as orderly as the rest of the institution. The air was thick with the mingled scents of boiled turnip, damp wool, and the faint iron tang of worn cutlery. Religion, while required, offered few surprises. Chapel services continued to draw the entire population together for intervals of song and sermon. The chaplain's reading of scripture was punctuated by the shuffling of restless children and the mechanical responses of a congregation that had learned the rhythms long ago. In moments of rare enthusiasm, a hymn might rise with genuine feeling, only to be quickly subdued by the more customary atmosphere of dutiful endurance. For some, faith served as a final interior refuge. For others, it was as routine as wiping boots or folding blankets, something to be endured for appearance's sake amidst the monotonous routine. the workhouse was occasionally shaken by events from outside. The publication of critical newspaper articles, the emergence of reform societies, and speeches in Parliament sometimes prompted cautious adjustments. New rules might appear on the notice board. Inspectors might arrive unannounced, spend a week complaining about the state of the bedding or the quality of the bread. Sometimes, a child was awarded an apprenticeship in a local business, or a sick inmate was transferred to a municipal infirmary with promises of better care. Such changes, though real, always seemed provisional, as if the system itself resisted transformation at every turn. The buildings of the workhouse, sturdy and utilitarian, remained unchanged. Their brick walls stood firm against the British weather. Their windows let in enough light to illuminate, but not enough to invite comfort. The iron gates, watched over by staff, with large keys and small tolerance for mischief, reinforced the boundary between the institution and the world beyond. Those who entered were reminded daily that the workhouse was not a place for hope, but rather a holding space, a necessary inconvenience for the nation and a persistent inconvenience for its inmates. Through all of this, the ordinary details of everyday life, labor, meals, regulations, defined existence far more than any grand event or act of Parliament. Occasionally, the rhythm of workhouse life was broken by matters of discipline and punishment, a subject that received as much attention in official handbooks as the day's menu. The Victorian belief in the formative power of discomfort meant that the rules were both numerous and strictly enforced. Punishments ranged from the trivial to the severe. A missed chore, a whispered conversation after lights out, or the surreptitious possession of a crust of bread could result in extra hours of work, a reduction in the already frugal food ration, or, for repeat offenders, solitary confinement in the punishment cell. The cell was a small, bare room, its single window set high and barred, with only a hard bench for company. The intention was not merely to isolate, but to inspire reflection, or at the very least, compliance. The staff approached these corrections with a sense of duty rather than malice. Matrons kept detailed logs of infractions. The master dispensed consequences with a measured tone that suggested personal feeling had long since been replaced by procedure. Inspectors, when they visited, paid close attention to the discipline records, partly to ensure the rules were being followed, and partly to confirm that the institution's deterrent function remained intact. The theory was that small inconveniences would prevent larger problems, a principle that sometimes left both inmates and staff caught in a cycle of minor grievances and official responses. These measures extended to every part of the workhouse routine. In the laundry, a lost item, or a less than brilliantly white sheet, might be traced back to a single individual, who would then be assigned additional, less desirable tasks. In the kitchen, any sign of food being hoarded or shared was swiftly addressed, often at the cost of an entire ward's rations for the following day. Even in the schoolroom, children found themselves on the receiving end of discipline, often administered in front of their classmates for maximum effect. The prevailing theory held that public correction would reinforce private resolve. Whether it succeeded is debatable, but it certainly reinforced an atmosphere of wary vigilance. Despite these controls, small acts of resistance and subtle negotiations were part of everyday life. Inmates developed quiet methods of communication, passing notes or coded gestures when staff were otherwise occupied. There were accepted tacit exchanges, an extra turn in the garden for someone who finished their work early, or a small favor in exchange for help mending clothes. Staff, often overwhelmed by the volume of duties, sometimes chose to ignore minor breaches so long as order did not visibly suffer. The entire institution ran on a combination of rules enforced and rules bent, creating a culture where everyone learned the art of navigating, if not quite circumventing, authority. Outside, the political climate was marked by cautious reform. The latter decades of the 19th century saw a growing appetite for change. even if it advanced at glacial speed. The publication of social investigations, the likes of Charles Booth's Survey of London Life, or Henry Mayhew's accounts of the poor, brought the realities of workhouse existence to wider public attention. Parliamentary debates grew more frequent, and new laws occasionally tinkered with the regulations, increasing the age for child apprenticeships or setting higher standards for cleanliness. These measures, while improving some conditions, rarely altered the core principle that poverty must be administered with a firm, unsentimental hand. The physical spaces of punishment within the workhouse were unmistakable. The punishment cell was never mistaken for a place of comfort. It was scrubbed daily, its cold stone floor unforgiving, and its silence complete, save for the distant echoes of daily activity. Nearby, the master's office included a locked cupboard containing the rulebooks and a ledger in which every infraction was faithfully recorded. The walls, painted in institutional grey or whitewash, stood as silent witnesses to the daily negotiation between order and resistance. For the vast majority, such punishments formed a recurring backdrop to life, rather than its central drama. Days were still filled with labour, meals, religious services, and the small economies of existence. Children continued to recite their lessons. The old and infirm occupied benches in the yard, observing the daily comings and goings. From time to time, a resident would simply disappear, discharged for good behaviour, transferred to an infirmary, or, more rarely, having escaped through some overlooked gate or lax supervision. Their absence was usually noted only in the ledgers, which persisted whether the inmates did or not. Thus, for all the talk of deterrence and discipline, life in the workhouse remained a study in managed monotony, the balance between rule and routine, punishment and lenience, determined the tempo of each day. In the end, the workhouse endured as an institution, not because it inspired hope, but because it managed to contain both poverty and the persistent, if faint, desire for something more than mere survival. Amid the endless routine and careful record-keeping, the workhouse population was neither static nor entirely resigned. Inmates arrived in steady trickles, some brought in by parish officers after a failed harvest, others appearing at the gates after illness or the collapse of seasonal employment. The Victorian economy was prone to sudden downturns. When factories closed or trade ebbed, the workhouse provided, if nothing else, 4 walls and a stricter diet than most could manage outside. There were also those who cycled in and out with the seasons, their arrivals and departures marked in the ledgers as routinely as deliveries of flour or soap. Life inside was marked by subtle gradations of fortune and status. New arrivals endured a period of quarantine and medical inspection, their scant belongings carefully listed and locked away. Clothes were exchanged for institutional uniforms, and hair was sometimes cut short to discourage lice. This ritual underscored the shift from individual to inmate, a transformation as symbolic as it was practical. Some inmates responded with resignation, others with brief rebellion, but all learned quickly that the rules were more reliable than the weather outside. For those who had been inside longest, a modest hierarchy asserted itself. Seniority brought small privileges, a seat closer to the fire on winter mornings, or the right to assist with the less strenuous tasks. Elderly women who had outlived their families sometimes served as unofficial mentors to younger inmates, dispensing advice that was as likely to concern the best method for scrubbing floors as it was any larger wisdom. In the men's wards, the atmosphere was more reserved, with camaraderie expressed sparingly, and usually in the form of shared complaints, rather than grand gestures. Children, as before, were treated as both wards and investments in future labour. Their education, such as it was, rarely rose above functional literacy and basic arithmetic. In larger workhouses, the older children sometimes left for apprenticeships in local businesses, though the transition from institutional discipline to industrial discipline was, in practical terms, a change of scenery rather than of circumstance. For the youngest, The nursery was a place of order tempered by noise, where play was always supervised and rest was encouraged for the sake of tomorrow's lessons. Religious observance remained woven into the routine, with the chapel providing the rarest opportunity for the population to gather in a single space. Special services marked funerals, baptisms, and holidays, each conducted with the same brisk efficiency as the rest of the institution. Death was not uncommon, particularly among the aged and infirm. When it occurred, it was handled with discretion. A short service, a note in the register, and a burial in the adjacent paupers' cemetery. The ceremony was brief, the attendance moderate, and the memory faded quickly into the ongoing concerns of daily life. Architecture continued to reinforce the authority of the workhouse. Heavy doors, narrow windows, and long corridors gave the sense of a place designed to channel movement and suppress anything resembling exuberance. The boiler room, with its persistent hum and the faint scent of coal smoke, was the closest the building came to warmth. The laundry, steamy and pungent, was always busy, even during spells of bad weather, when drying laundry simply meant adding to the damp indoors. In the kitchen, the clang of pots and the steady rhythm of chopping and stirring marked the passing of hours as surely as the tolling of the bell overhead. Society outside continued to evolve. Political campaigns for reform gained ground, sometimes resulting in modest improvements, an extra ounce of bread, a slightly longer interval between inspections, or, in rare cases, something resembling medical care for the chronically ill. The workhouse, however, absorbed these changes slowly. The old ledgers remained, growing heavier with each year. The staff, some of whom had been in service for decades, navigated new regulations with the same care and caution they applied to everything else. Trade connections outside remained practical, but uninspiring. Local farmers occasionally sold surplus vegetables to the institution, and cobblers repaired boots worn thin by endless pacing. The arrival of goods was met with more curiosity than excitement. Even so, these exchanges tied the workhouse to its wider community in ways that could not be wholly ignored. After all, the line between inside and outside was never so solid as the architecture suggested. In this way, the workhouse continued to function, part institution, part community, and part reminder of a society's ongoing struggle with the consequences of poverty. Its daily rhythms, however carefully managed, could not entirely suppress the persistence of human adaptation, hope, and endurance. Inmates endured, staff persisted, and the ledgers grew longer, marking the quiet passage of years within the institution's ever-watchful walls. The closing decades of the 19th century brought a slow but perceptible shift in the atmosphere surrounding the workhouse. While its functions and routines remained largely unchanged, the outside world pressed ever more insistently on its boundaries. Urban growth, improving communications, and the gradual expansion of a print culture meant that stories of what happened within workhouse walls traveled beyond parish borders. Scandals, rare but memorable, appeared in local newspapers, describing deaths from neglect or the mismanagement of food, stirring public sentiment and drawing the attention of social campaigners. It became increasingly difficult for workhouse administrators to maintain the illusion of quiet self-containment. Inside, the staff carried on as always, though the most experienced matrons and masters recognized that scrutiny had become a permanent feature of their work. Inspections grew more frequent. Some announced, others contrived to be surprises. There were new instructions from the guardians about cleanliness, the administration of punishment, and the treatment of sick inmates. Official forms multiplied, and with them, the hours spent in the master's office, squinting at ledgers by lamplight. Some staff adapted with quiet resignation, while others took perverse pride in their ability to demonstrate perfect compliance with every directive, even when the practical benefits were debatable. The rhythms of daily life, for the inmates, remained as steady as ever. The bells still marked the beginning and end of each activity. Meals continue to be portioned with care and eaten in silence. Illness, as always, complicated these routines. Periodic outbreaks of influenza, measles, or other infectious diseases swept through the cramped wards, leaving the infirmary crowded. Medical care was basic, with treatments confined to mustard plasters, poultices. In the most progressive workhouses, the careful distribution of cod liver oil and quinine. The resident nurse, if present, often worked from dawn until dusk, monitoring temperatures and dispensing remedies while struggling to keep the fever ward from descending into chaos. Outside the sick rooms, the ordinary tasks of the institution continued. Work in the laundry intensified during outbreaks of disease, with sheets boiled and reboiled under the watchful eye of supervisors. The kitchen staff, perpetually short-handed, adjusted recipes to accommodate whatever vegetables could be sourced most cheaply. The scent of soap, cabbage, and carbolic hung in the air, mingling with the more persistent odor of damp stone. Inmates found brief distraction in small projects, mending clothing, tending the garden, or attempting to teach a fellow resident a hymn or arithmetic sum. These moments of minor accomplishment, while rarely celebrated, added texture to otherwise repetitive days. Political attention to the fate of the poor became harder to avoid. By the 1880s and 90s, election campaigns increasingly featured debates on the future of the poor law and the adequacy of workhouse provision. Social reformers, such as Joseph Chamberlain and Charles Booth, published surveys and reports that made the realities of workhouse life available to a national reading public. The demand for humane treatment of children, the elderly, and the sick grew louder, even as official budgets remained tight. Parliament debated amendments, and new acts sometimes forced reluctant parishes to make minor improvements, such as better ventilation, increased rations for growing children, or upgraded infirmary facilities. Architecture, while slow to change, reflected these new priorities at the margins. Some larger workhouses added separate infirmary blocks, often built of red brick and situated on the edge of the main yard. Windows were sometimes enlarged to admit more light. A few institutions experimented with separate children's homes or the establishment of workshops where productive labor could be exchanged for a modest wage. These innovations, though limited, did much to soften the harshest contours of the Victorian workhouse, even if they were as much about public appearances as genuine transformation. Trade and agriculture, too, adapted only as necessity required. The kitchen gardens now occasionally grew modest quantities of tomatoes or rhubarb alongside the root vegetables. Inmates sometimes sold small bundles of kindling or handmade brushes at local markets, the proceeds returning to the general fund. Such enterprise was tolerated, provided it did not distract from the primary duty of self-discipline. The produce from local farms continued to supplement rations, but the supply remained erratic and the quality uneven. Throughout these changes, the core of workhouse life persisted. The bells still rang, the ledgers grew, and the routines endured. Yet, among the inmates and staff, there was a growing sense that the days of the classical workhouse were numbered. The institution's power to inspire fear or resignation had begun, at last, to diminish under the collective weight of public scrutiny and political unease. Even for those within its walls, the prospect of change, however uncertain, had become impossible to ignore. By the final years of the 19th century, the future of the workhouse was openly questioned in newspapers, Parliament, and even around the dinner tables of the moderately concerned middle class. Reports of neglect and stories of quiet endurance circulated together, forming a picture far removed from the confident reformist rhetoric of the early Victorian era. The workhouse had become a symbol less of social salvation than of institutional fatigue. Its heavy doors had outlasted the optimism of their architects. And within many parishes, the building's presence was a reminder that progress, where it occurred, was uneven and often reluctant. Within the daily rhythm, Change crept in, sometimes announced, and sometimes simply absorbed. Inmates continued to rise to the morning bell and assemble in the dormitory light for roll call. Uniforms were distributed, and the rituals of washing, eating, and labor filled the hours as before. Yet the atmosphere was touched by a faint sense of anticipation, as if both staff and residents were waiting for something not quite named. Younger matrons occasionally discussed the possibility of new work elsewhere, in hospitals or charitable homes that offered slightly better pay and rather fewer rules. Some among the older staff, having spent decades within these walls, watched as new forms and revised ledgers arrived, each one promising improvement and delivering mostly paperwork. The medical side of the institution, having grown in importance, now occupied a space all its own. Infirmary wards, sometimes placed in new buildings or separated by additional corridors, could be found filled with the elderly, the sick, and the chronically unwell. The atmosphere was quieter than in the main wards, marked by the muted clink of medicine bottles and the soft tread of nurses in starched aprons. The smell of carbolic hung in the air. Some patients lingered for months or years, their lives measured out in regular doses, occasional visits from local doctors, and the uneasy company of fellow inmates. Death was handled with greater ceremony than before, though funerals remained brief and attended by only a scattering of residents and staff. Names were entered in registers written neatly by a clerk, who perhaps had begun to suspect the workhouse system was on borrowed time. Children, too, saw gradual changes in their experience. As public concern grew, many parishes established separate homes or cottage schools intended to spare the youngest residents the full force of institutional discipline. Inspectors arrived more frequently, checking for cleanliness and ensuring that the curriculum included not only scripture and arithmetic, but also practical skills. Some children were sent out as apprentices or placed in foster homes, a process watched with both hope and suspicion by those left behind. The youngest rarely understood the politics that shaped their lives. For them, the taste of porridge or the feel of winter wool counted for more than debates in London. Trade and agriculture within the workhouse walls adapted in minor but telling ways. The kitchen garden may have expanded slightly, with the introduction of gooseberries or broad beans along the old rows of turnips. Laundry continued as always, though new boilers and wringers appeared, accompanied by instructions to reduce costs and increase efficiency. Inmates who displayed aptitude might be selected for more skilled work, such as tailoring or carpentry. Small items produced on site sometimes found their way to local fairs or charity bazaars, advertised as the honest product of industrious hands. Religious routine retained its place, though with signs of gentle relaxation. Sunday chapel services went on, but more often the sermons included appeals to compassion or the virtue of charity, rather than the brisk admonishments of earlier decades. Hymns, sung with varying degrees of enthusiasm, lifted to the rafters of chapels that were now just as likely to echo with official inspection reports as with the voices of the congregation. Chaplains and visiting clergy increasingly balanced messages of discipline with those of hope, though the practical effect was limited by rationed candles and the persistent chill of unheated stone. Outside the walls, the growing apparatus of the state began to take a greater interest in the welfare of its poorest citizens. New laws, such as the Local Government Act of 1888, created county councils and gradually shifted responsibility for public health and poor relief from parishes to larger political bodies. This period saw tentative discussions about the abolition of the workhouse, the separation of medical care from poor relief, and the introduction of old age pensions. Debates in Parliament and articles in the press reflected the changing mood, though the machinery of reform groaned slowly forward. By the century's end, the workhouse was no longer a place of singular dread, but rather a fading relic of an older, sterner model of poverty management. Its architecture remained, its records grew, and its population rose and fell with the economic tides. Yet beneath the surface, A new era was forming, one in which the workhouse, for all its weight of rules and stone, would finally be set aside in favor of something, if not gentler, then at least different